Good afternoon, everyone. I'm speaking to you from my home office in Belmont, Massachusetts, and my colleagues on this presentation are in Cambridge, I believe, at the moment. We have, as is typical for January, a very intimate group of participants for this webinar, and I think that that will lend itself to a good conversation at the end of this session. Our guest today is Tim Carter. Tim is the president of Second Nature, a national nonprofit based in Boston with a mission to accelerate climate action in and through higher education. Tim himself has a background in ecology. He has his BS in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and completed his PhD in ecology from the Odum School of Ecology at the University of Georgia. He is quite comfortable dealing with a collection of 400 colleges and universities across the United States in aiming them at sustainability and climate change goals that we have learned are essential in the 21st century. It's our pleasure to have him, and he has a presentation ready for us. So Tim, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jim. It's good to be with everybody, and thanks for the invitation to present to this group. Let me go ahead and get these slides up. Thumb up, Jim, if you can see those, just so I can. Does that look good? Got it. Great. As Jim said, I'm Tim Carter. I'm president of Second Nature. I've been in this position for about 7 years. And I do have a background in ecology. My history has been urban ecology, thinking about human and natural systems and the connection between those two. So it's kind of a natural extension, no pun intended, I guess, for me to be working on an issue like climate change, which has so many interconnected and dynamic facets of it. I'm going to be talking about basically how Second Nature approaches our work generally. And then both Jim and Marianne, when we were talking about this a few days ago, mentioned the explicit connection to two things. One is land conservation and the ability potentially of land to be a carbon sink, and what you might be interested in as the audience, and thinking through what that capacity might be. And then also a little bit about policy, because we do engage in advocacy and policy. So I wanted to touch on those two things in addition to our general organizational background. So this is a complicated slide. I'm going to spend a few minutes here on this one. When you or we think about higher education, often there's a very specific thing that comes to mind. So you may be a researcher and you think the role of higher education actually just to generate new knowledge, like that could be it. Or you're an instructor, you like to teach, and really it's about educating students. If you are an operations person, you may think, oh, the role of higher ed is to actually keep these buildings intact, or provide a great park environment for the community. There could be a variety of perspectives you have as a member of the higher education ecosystem. We try to think about the whole of higher ed as containing assets that can help accelerate climate action. So as Jim mentioned, our mission is to accelerate climate action in and through higher ed. And in that sense, I'd just like to walk through quickly these 7 categories of action that have specific functions attached to them, and then how they relate to this language on the left of actor enabler. So take a look at this first column with category at the top. And in each of these areas, you can imagine staff or faculty or students engaging in this categorical type of activity that, if you connect it to climate action, can really help mobilize the assets of higher education towards an end that we all want to see, which is solutions to the climate crisis. So with research, it's often the ones that come to mind, the basic and translational research that happens by faculty, publications that happen, and that subject matter expertise actually is really leaned upon by people inside the institution, inside your networks, as well as outside the institution. Also, the formation and activity around being an anchor institution. When we say that, we mean these are oftentimes, like in Cambridge, they're some of the largest landholders, largest employers, biggest drivers of the economy. Most conveners are higher ed institutions in the communities that they're a part of. And so as that collection of characteristics forms an anchor institution, and they're often lifetime institutions. They're going to be there forever. They're not going to leave. Different than business. So that function as both an anchor institution that has all these multi-functions attached to it, as well as research, that actually serves something outside of the institution itself. And in that sense, we call that an enabling action of higher ed. So that word on the left, you'll see this enabler and actor. And these are two really clear examples of how higher education can enable action in others. Through the new knowledge that's being generated, it allows for progress to happen on climate that wouldn't happen otherwise in other sectors. It allows for technology breakthroughs. As an anchor institution, it allows for convenings to happen. It allows for practices to be developed and tested. It allows for awareness to be increased. And all those things actually are enabling functions. Then there's this other block in the middle here of education, advocacy, and use of investment in finance. Really key important assets of higher ed. And you can see how they work themselves out in the curriculum. That's something we're very familiar with. For advocacy, you can imagine student activism, raising issues on campus. People protesting outside the president's office saying, we want to change, we want to see this change, that change on campus. And the institutions themselves advocating for policies. I mean, just I think yesterday the Competes Act was announced in the House. There's tons of research dollars in there and that was a result of policy positions and advocacy that happens. And then lastly, the investments in finance. Oftentimes we think about endowments as a key area of investment and a key asset of the university. And those endowments can be used beneficially and they can be used not beneficially. And so there's been a big movement, as I'm sure most of you know, around divestment, which is a little bit different than thinking about intentional investing. And both of those sides are really important. But when you think about those three areas, you can think about those both being in service of the institution, as well as in service of those outside the institution. And there are models for both of those things. And that's where we introduce this other term called the higher education as an actor, as an institutional actor. So there are things that benefit the institution itself, as well as enabling action in others. So in this middle category, it's a bit of a blurred line. It can be both. Education, advocacy, investment can benefit the university itself as well as others. And then lastly, there's two more kind of categories to just touch on, and that is administrative leadership. So there's a really important function whenever you're creating an institutional strategy as a higher education institution, and you develop commitments you're going to make for your own institution. You're going to commit to local food purchasing, or you're going to commit to decarbonization in our case. And those senior leadership commitments are something that very much serve the institution. Paired with that are often operational commitments. And in our case, there's decarbonization that has happened and continues to happen. And those are really institutional. As an institutional actor, how can you be an accelerator? How can you do things because you as an institution are doing it that serve yourself, but then also provide an example for others? But it's not itself something that's enabling other activity. It's more like providing an example. What we talk about is, are you practicing what you teach? So a lot of these things in the institutional actor category fall into that. So this is just a framework, a way of thinking about how does higher education, and when we think about higher education, how do all the assets of higher education together, how can we think about them not in isolation, but together? And in doing so, can we bring other people into this process or into our, like some ways to ally with them to accomplish the goals we might have? On the right, then you'll see like various scaling mechanisms. And that oftentimes is our role as an organization. We're really a network organization. Jim mentioned we have membership. I'll talk about that in a second. But these scaling mechanisms are really important for taking what is done at an individual institution, whether it's an acting function or an enabling function, and then taking it beyond what that institution can do on its own. So have that in mind, have some of these key terms in mind, both whole of higher ed in these various categories, as well as some of those categories being enabling action in others, as well as institutional actors. So actor and enabler. We'll come back to that in a second. Our primary theory of change is that senior leadership, presidents and chancellors, make a huge difference when it comes to an institution being able to mobilize around climate. And so we have a program. Our primary program is one in which presidents and chancellors commit their institutions to a process that we manage. And we call these the President's Climate Leadership Commitments. These were started in 2006, 2007. And so they've been going on for about 15 years now. And they're the longest standing voluntary carbon climate action commitment anywhere in the world in any sector. We have about, I'll tell you in a second the statistics, but this is essentially what the commitment looks like. A president signs the commitment, and the commitment has a variety of requirements that they have to do as an institution. You have to declare a carbon neutrality date. You have to commit to creating exposure to climate action for all of your students. So a mechanism to do that, you have to figure out how to do that. You have to actually increase the climate research that's happening on your campus. And you embed all that into your climate action plan. And so when we started this 2006, 15 years ago, there was hardly any climate action planning that had happened on campus. In fact, sustainability coordinators were not really that big of a thing. And it kind of shaped the sector and shaped roles within the sector. Many institutions now have sustainability coordinators because their president or chancellor signed the commitment. Once you then sign, and there's a series of steps that you can see here. You have to do a greenhouse gas inventory, you submit progress to us on an annual basis. You complete a climate action plan within 2 years of signing, and then you review and update that plan every 5 years. So this group of institutions that have made that commitment, the president or chancellors made that commitment, we call them the Climate Leadership Network. And we have roughly 450 schools. You know, they come and go. Over our history, we've had over 800 schools that have signed the commitment. But there is rigor attached to it. So if you don't do what you say you're going to do in the commitment, we'll actually remove you from the network. So all of our schools are actively in this, and you can sit in certain parts of the country. But you know, wide representation of institution type, of geography. So, and that's actually a strength. The breadth of institutions are really a strength. And so then what do we do? What we do is support this network. We develop various forms of resources that help campuses meet the goals that they did. We've done a lot of focus around renewable energy, for example. So here's just, you can read here, we not only have written materials, these primers, but then we have templates that they can use if you want to contract with a consultant. We have term sheets that they could use for a power purchase agreement if they want to do that. So various forms of online accessible resources for our membership. We also run an acceleration fund. We started this a few years ago, very modest funding that we re-grant to institutions to help them get some projects past the point of conceptual phase, or help them accelerate what they were already starting. So we've run this a couple of years, focused it on initially cross-sector activity, and then more recently on climate justice related activity. We have a data tool that has, in partnership with the University of New Hampshire, showed the progress that campuses were making. You got to track that. It's actually a really essential part of the commitment, is that we've tracked those data over time. We're about to release a new version of our reporting platform that's fully integrated with this SciMap tool at the University of New Hampshire. And then we put on events, various forms of events, as like webinars like this, but we also do larger events. Over this past year, we did this thing called the Climate Action Pursuit, which was a series of connected events that were leading towards goals that pursuit teams are working towards. And then here in April 5th to 8th, we're going to have a virtual summit. Oftentimes we'll have these in person. Pre-COVID we did, and we'll go back to that in-person event in 2023. But I would encourage everybody, I probably should put a link in here, but can send that afterwards, a link to our Higher Education Climate Leadership Summit in April. And you can see a partner here, our Intentional Endowments Network. I think you saw that logo on a previous slide. We do the summit in partnership with them, and so it brings together these really interesting topics that integrate investing, finance, and climate action on campus. And so you gotta say, well, that's all great, but does it actually matter? That's a fair question. And it actually has. We have data to support the fact you compare signatory institutions and non-signatory institutions. There is a relationship. So signatory campuses have emitted 47% less carbon and 27% less energy than non-signatory institutions. So it does seem like this theory of change has some backing in the data. And you know, our fundamental role here is to actually be an accelerant. You know, we don't want just business as usual. We all know the climate crisis is immediate, it's very urgent. We have to move really quickly. And let me just touch here for a second on yeah, thanks Robin for putting that in there. On the connection to working lands, because I know this group is really interested in that. You can, the same way we think about the whole of higher ed and all those different categories, you can think about, I think, enabling functions and acting functions, and we've seen that among our network. Both Duke and Colgate are members of ours. And when you think about Duke's role in setting criteria in North Carolina around a natural working lands policy, like that was done right out of the Nicholas Institute by research. And probably in your institution, you might have some relationship with one of the public entities, whether it's local or state or regional or whatever. And you can contribute that expertise to help them accomplish what they want to get done. Classic example of an enabling function. Secondly, campuses actually have started to manage their property, their forests, or their whatever property they might have for carbon goals. So I think actually Alpine has a case study about this, and we've done a webinar with our colleagues at Colgate about how they are managing their forests in order to account for the storage that takes place there, and how could you optimize that storage and sequestration for the campus goals that they might have under our commitments. I think there really is an interesting dynamic here. Are we just starting to scratch the surface of what's possible for this carbon sequestration? But those are good examples of what we were talking about earlier, enabling actions and institutional actions. So acting as an enabler and as an actor. Let me just give a pivot a little bit into policy and advocacy. And just to say a few things up front, when we have 450 institutions all across the country, you have to be really careful and thoughtful positions you might take, because we have people who are in California. We have all the University of California schools, for example, and we have people who are in Indiana, Kentucky, the Southeast, you know, largely red states. And whenever we engage in policy and advocacy, we have to be really thoughtful about that. We have a good partnership with a group here in Boston called Ceres, who represents the business community and corporate community and investing community. And a lot of our advocacy work is done in partnership with them. And so we work at the state level and at the level to advocate for things he cares about, but more importantly, that will actually move the needle on climate. Whenever the federal administration changes, especially in office, you saw a major move into the non-federal actors. So states, cities, healthcare institutions, cultural institutions, you saw a big move for them saying, well, if the feds are clearly not going to do this, one of the initial things that President Trump did was actually withdraw the process of within the US from the Paris Agreement, this global agreement. And that actually energized this group of non-federal actors, and it gave really a sense of ownership around the US's climate activity. So as one example of the type of advocacy where we represent the sector, I just wanted to mention this initiative. The initiative was called, some of you may have heard of it, a major mobilization across all these sectors. And if you would add up all the contributions of the non-federal actors, not only was it a huge part of our emissions profile, roughly 30 to 40% of emissions. And it was like the fourth, if we would have been a country, would have been fourth largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. But it was also one of the largest asset. Sorry about that. So did it start getting glitchy here or a little bit before?
You're all right.
Right here. Okay. So basically I was saying that this non-federal actor group is a big one. That's a takeaway from this slide. It's a huge part of emissions and part of the economy. And so what we did at like international events, like the COP in a couple of the Conference of Parties, there wasn't any federal presence to speak of during the Trump administration. So all these non-federal actors came together. And this is actually a funny one because this is Harrison Ford that came and spoke. And he's like the most, everyone wanted to see Harrison Ford. But we had a presence in these international events where there historically, if we wouldn't have been there, then we would have had no U.S. center. So with this group, then we were able to develop an analysis, an assessment about, well, what could the contribution be to the US's reduction in emissions if we had these non-federal actors actually contributing to the solutions. And this now is under the framework of this America is All In group. It was We Are Still In, but then President Biden came in and now we're back in. So we're not have to say we are still in, America is all in. And we can still say, well, given the contribution of these subnational actors, how much can we contribute to the reduction in emissions in the US? And so this is what we're calling the all-in strategy. And there's kind of three main pillars. And you'll see the reason I mention this is the bottom, you'll see this healthy lands is the third of the three pillars. And there's really good data on how just with subnational commitments, independent of the federal government, we can still make a pretty big dent in our emissions profile. And this is by 2030. So the estimate was roughly around 50% reduction by 2030 if all the subnational actors reach their highest level of ambition. So if colleges and universities took the commitments that we did have and actually implemented them at the goals of which they had, if the states implemented the highest level of ambition that they had, we can actually get pretty far to the 2030 target, which is what we need to do in order to stay under this 1.5 degree threshold. You can see the LULUCF is basically working lands, land use and land cover and forestry change. That's about roughly 10 to 11% of our emissions. And when you project it forward with the policies that are in place, it actually doesn't improve it a ton with the levers we have right now in the public sphere to change. There's not a ton of deforestation that happens in the US specifically. There's not a ton of public land that can be used in a significant way for carbon sequestration. So it changes it about 1%. And I'll actually just go down to this one. If you look at maximum land use effort in that all-in scenario, and this would include colleges and universities, you're going to increase that. You're going to increase the decrease by about 1%. So it's good to just know the scale. And one of the reasons why Second Nature specifically hasn't done a ton in the land cover for sequestration area is because when we look at something like the energy sector, there's a roughly 30% increase in the decrease in emissions that you could create from converting the energy sector. So we spent more time in those other areas than we have in land specifically. Doesn't mean there's not great potential there. And I think the estimates are around like maybe a 20% increase if all land, including private land, was maximized for carbon sequestration. So it's not nothing, and it definitely can't go away, but it is a fairly small fraction of what the targets are under these kind of joint shared scenarios of the all-in assessment. One of the last things I'll mention here, though, is that the all-in strategy actually uses this complementary approach. So remember, we started with universities being actors and enablers. And I think one of the underappreciated roles that we've found so far with the all-in work, this kind of joint work among non-federal actors, is that the complementarity between the sectors has not been as strong and not worked on as much. It's like businesses are going in parallel, universities kind of go in parallel, healthcare goes in parallel, but we haven't sat down and said, well, what if we would actually leverage the research capacity of universities to help specifically that business who owns a ton of property next door accomplish its carbon goals? Or maybe we take a class, a student class, and actually connect them with their city or their state and help them actually solve something that the state has going on. That knowledge area that universities has is kind of a unique asset. And that's very different than the asset of like a business, which mobilizes capital very quickly. It's just a different type of strength. So what would happen if you paired mobilization of capital with knowledge resources, and together then you could create some strategies around that? I don't think we've done a very good job of that within this all-in coalition. And hopefully it's an area that we'll continue to pursue in the future. So just coming back to this, like really wrapping up, I hope this gave you a sense of how we think about the sector as a mobilizing force. Hopefully you caught some of that in my comments. And when we think about it with you as like, what role does land and forest conservation and land conservation play in accelerating climate action? We have to think about all of those aspects, not just the physical space, but how do researchers engage with your space? And might there be some lessons that could be shared across other sectors? And could we help broker that? Could we help facilitate that as Second Nature, as a network organization? And maybe there's some connections with institutions that you don't have right now. We work globally, as mentioned. We're at the COP at these events. Maybe there's some areas of opportunity around the world that you wanted to do or think about, and we can help facilitate that as a partner. And so we would love to explore that in the future. I know Jim and Marianne and I have started those conversations, but and maybe this is a place to just kind of pause and get your thoughts there, but know that those follow-up conversations will happen as well. So sorry about the volume there. Of course, it happened midstream, but I'm happy to pause here and take any questions.
Much better. All right, so let me invite the 25 people who are online right now to put their questions in the Q&A box. And I will start off with a couple of questions, and we can go from there. One is, Tim, you had a slide that showed a decline of 47% in carbon and 27% in energy of your institutions versus the general economy. And my question is, how do you measure that? Is that per square foot of space, or is it per student, or what's the unit that you use to measure that?
Yeah, this is just so you create a boundary whenever you're creating a greenhouse gas inventory for your campus. So campuses will put their boundary in, they determine that however they will. Usually it's the boundary of campus, but some campuses have multiple sites, and obviously there's land that people have. And so when we had comparison of institutions that have signed the commitment, and I don't think it's a per unit basis, I think it was a total emissions profile of those campuses. And so I don't know the exact answer to your question, Jim. But when you compare the two apples to apples, when you normalize it, that's where that reduction came from. We slice it according to emissions per student, emissions per square foot, and then we divide it into institution type. It gets a little bit squirrely because sometimes, like for years, our leading institution was one called the American Public University System, which has one building in West Virginia. And they basically have, I don't know, 90,000 some enrollees, because they're all about their military who are enrolled. And so they had this amazing emissions per student, and because it was just one building. But most campuses are larger than that. This group, Sightlines and University of New Hampshire, were the ones that did the report. So I could go back and share that with you if you want to see more details about that.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see, because I guess what I'd be interested in perhaps is similar sized campuses with similar student bodies. How does one that's taken the carbon commitment compare to one which is not?
Yeah.
And that's what I thought you were doing.
I'm just not sure how they normalized it. I know they did. I know they made that in order to get that number they did. I'm just not exactly sure what the methods they used in that study.
Okay. So my next question is, in the 2022-2023 horizon, what's the next big initiative for Second Nature? What's your, as we recover from the COVID, hopefully we recover from the COVID pandemic, what's the next big initiative that you're set out on?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's kind of, I would say, two areas of important strategic focus. We're actually going through it, going to start a strategic process here in the next few weeks. One is this area of climate justice, and the work around climate solutions historically has been largely the purview of, in our case, when presidents made the initial commitment, it largely got into a very operational focus. It's like, how do we change out our light bulbs, convert our energy system? And the staff that were hired were largely in those offices of facilities, which is an important thing to happen. I think the maturing of the commitments has led to issues of who benefits and doesn't benefit from these solutions, and who is disproportionately or not disproportionately impacted by climate. Those are questions of justice and equity that a given technology, putting in a new boiler or whatever, isn't really addressing. And so that is increasingly an area of focus for us. It has been over the years, but increasingly that's an area of focus for us. And that necessarily then connects the university to communities in different ways. We've been working on resilience for a number of years, but this kind of intersectional work between campus and community is one area. I think a second area is really like, we've been individually at a campus, and we've been national, in some ways international. How do you think about like maybe more regionally scaled solutions? And so we're in the process actually of hiring a couple regional managers for the first time in the Midwest and the Southeast to kind of test out like a regional model for network design and climate action. And so those are two areas just for us organizationally, I know, that are important. I think in the global sense, if Build Back Better doesn't get passed, there's got to be some federal legislation that goes through if we want to have any credibility, both domestically and internationally. There's got to be a way to allocate those resources that are going to flow out of those bills in a way that pushes it towards solutions. And if that doesn't happen, then we'll be in tough shape. So there's a lot of advocacy work that has to happen to make that the case.
Okay, so I have two questions from the floor for you. The first is from Artemis Domley, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, who's asking, are you interested in non-US participation in the network?
Oh, yes. We actually, I didn't put this in here, but we have, we brought higher education into this Race to Zero campaign that the UN ran in advance of COP26. So we have about 1,000 institutions that are part of that Race to Zero. So that's one mechanism that that you can engage with us. And then we actually are, it's possible to join our network even though we're dominated by US institutions, and most of our resources and material are in English, kind of use US units of measurement. It's still possible to engage. We have a group called the University Climate Change Coalition that has Canadian and Mexican schools, and we do have a number of institutions from outside the US who are interested in joining. So feel free to be in touch with me directly about that.
And so how do they do that? They pay the dues just like any other US institution and participate as they see fit.
Yeah, we usually start with a conversation. The thing that's difficult about international, and you can't just put this as a blanket for everybody, that sometimes the presidents and chancellors, the US model is very different than other countries. And so we have to be sensitive to depending on what country you're in, if the president and chancellor actually has no power, for example, they're just a figurehead, then it really doesn't matter what they do. And maybe the state actually controls all the infrastructure. So then the commitment itself actually doesn't hold as much catalytic weight or power. And so we have to be we just take those as one-off cases. And so depending on where you are in the world, it really, we want it to benefit both the university and the network to have new members. So we would want to have that conversation first before just kind of carte blanche saying anybody can join anywhere.
And Tim, again, just for Artemis's reference, what's your email address?
Yeah, you can get in touch with me, T as in Tim, Carter, T Carter at secondnature.org.
T Carter at secondnature.org. Okay,
yeah,
good. All right, second question comes from David Foster, who asks, who says, I would be interested in learning more about your thinking on the potential for higher ed to work with land and contribute to climate change mitigation. Universities have great potential to work with and influence the decision-making of many actors, especially private landowners through collaborations and with land conservation organizations. This is one sphere where Alpine, which is a network that we operate, sees great potential for colleges and universities to make a difference in New England. I'm sure that Jim and Marianne can expand on this, but what through extension services and through research and through many different avenues, particularly state institutions, but also private institutions like Duke that are interested in this, have been pretty successful at working with local networks to change land management practices in forestry and also in agriculture, in renewable or regenerative agriculture. What potential do you see in that area going forward?
Yeah, I think it's a huge one. It's like you say, Jim, it's existed in that kind of enabling function. If you think about that, like universities as this resource in service of others. I think when you start to think about how do you design carbon sequestration programs for the institutions themselves, or specifically for a state's climate action plan, either of those cases, both enabling and acting, you could see possibilities being pretty great for universities. And the knowledge base is, very rich. I think there's, like when I was at Georgia, we actually did a bunch of kind of land use modeling around both endangered species. So like looking at areas that could protect or not protect species, as well as in the coastal Georgia area, how sea level rise is going to affect land use and land conservation, and then developing plans for some landscape scale conservation mapping practices. So it's been going on for a while. I think carbon sequestration potential, along with working with landowners and having some credibility with private landowners, especially, that's where the largest amount of land is going to be held. That's a real critical part of that engagement, I would think. And to some extent, universities do have that credibility. The extension service you mentioned, sometimes people don't even know that's a university program.
Right. In Massachusetts, it's at UMass, for example, and Paul Catanzaro, who had to leave, helps to do that. So there is perhaps a conversation going forward about how Second Nature can help encourage that. All right. So I have a question from Mimi Scheller. Do you have examples of campus adoption of renewable energy generation or low carbon transport plans that also support decarbonization in the surrounding community, not just on campus, but in the vicinity of the campus? How can town-gown alliances be supported in this area? Are there best practices or recommendations for shared energy transitions?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mimi. I think there's, a little bit depends on where you are, but almost any campus, the infrastructure that they have is going to connect into their community in some way. And so especially when you're talking about large scale, utility scale renewable energy projects, like a good example is here in Boston, MIT has a carbon neutrality goal. They did a joint procurement of renewable energy offsite. Actually, the farm is in North Carolina. They did a joint procurement of that with the Boston Medical Center and um, a park in downtown Boston. And so by doing that jointly, it actually helped these other entities meet their goals, which obviously is part of Boston and Cambridge area. When Harvard set, we kind of have a little bit of a love-hate with Harvard, but when they set their carbon neutrality target, it was because the city of Cambridge had a similar carbon neutrality goal. So they're very much almost one and the same. You can't disconnect some of these jurisdictions from the universities. And that gets at that anchor institution role. Probably almost every, trying to think of a case where it wasn't, even a place like Middlebury, is like, they're a carbon neutral campus. A lot of their conversion does connect with community priorities as well.
Right.
So it's hard to, we're at this point when it's different. Like we started, and I mentioned changing out the light bulbs, and that really, you can do that and no one else knows about it in your community. But once you get into large scale, big conversions of energy systems, it's impossible. And it's kind of stupid to try to think of yourself as a little island, because you get so much benefit from benefiting the community with the action that you committed to anyway. And there's tons of cities now, tons of states that have these really aggressive targets around climate. And it just makes so much sense. The city of Atlanta, for example, net zero goals, carbon neutrality goals. So Georgia Tech, Agnes Scott, these places that are in the Atlanta area, they want to work together with the city of Atlanta to make that happen. So it's all over the place.
Does Second Nature have town gown kind of programs that are focused on that?
Well, we do. So we've done some things, that it's kind of a broad phrase, town gown. Our presidents have talked about the various relationships they've had with their communities, and it's usually some case, on a case study basis. One of our presidents on our steering committee is Allegheny College, which is in Meadville, Pennsylvania, major fracking country, very economically challenged. And they see their role as an economic development engine for the city. And they have joint staffing, joint relationships with the city, with the hospital, in order for that, town gown to be improved. I think, something to just be mindful of, that historically universities have not been good community partners in some cases. And so you have these very toxic historic relationships that you can't just go in and say, we're the university, we're here to help. It's actually, you're doing it in co-creation and meeting a community need and talking to the community about what they actually need, not just saying, well, we know best and we're going to come in and help you. I think that's a bit of the evolution, is understanding that the university, yes, is an asset, but they aren't, it's patronizing to come in and tell the community, here's what's best for you.
Understood.
And that's some of the lessons around justice and equity that we're trying to infuse into our schools, as well as around the resilience side.
Right. So Brian Hall asked, does Second Nature help institutions figure out what their current carbon outputs are and where savings could be achieved?
We do. We have some members of our team work like with that SciMap team to have that tool. We do trainings on how to use the tool, how to identify various, these emissions are typically done in scopes. So scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and then we'll talk about it in scope 1. What's the best practice? We have climate action planning guides. How do you develop, the best way to eliminate scope 2 emissions, or what do you do about airline travel? We have working groups that we convene around that. So there's all sorts of network-based activity that we help support campuses, whether you're just starting out or, like Arizona State, way far beyond as a large institution. We try to accommodate that spectrum of the network and use knowledge exchange to actually make that happen.
So you're providing tools for universities and colleges to use. Do you ever audit their use of those tools? I mean, if they send you in a carbon plan and they say, here's what we want to do you ever send a team out and say, well, that makes sense, or we don't think that's achievable?
We've done that. We've done a little bit of that prior to people signing the commitment. Oftentimes they'll come to us and say, are we, is this a fool's errand? And so we'll come out and say, well, you have this, and this in place. And and then we respond to requests all the time about helping people answer some questions they might have. So yeah, there's something else to that question. Ask that again, Jim. Your question.
So can you verify?
Oh,
really
yeah,
what
yeah,
I'm asking is there a way to verify the achievement of plans?
Yeah. So that's a little bit different. So the idea of, so we have about 10 schools that are carbon neutral, and it is self-reported data. What we look at when we look at those greenhouse gas inventories is anything out of whack? But if you lie on that report, you'll probably be able to get through. One of the things we're currently working on is, could we establish a verification service, a more explicit verification service? Because these carbon neutrality claims are increasing. And when someone makes a claim, we'll go back, talk to them about, let's look at these scopes and make sure that everything's in order. But in the first cut, like, our data is, when they submit reports to us, it is self-reported data. We don't go back and audit everyone's GHG inventory. When we've done that, we do it periodically, just at a kind of like an institution type, where we'll look at all the community colleges, we'll look at all the research universities, just to see where different categories of activity mostly come in. And so we do that a little bit, but we're there's other, like the climate registry. I know CDP does some real specific auditing, slightly different than most of the time for us. But there's not thousands of claims being made right now. We just anticipate that claims will increase in the future. Hopefully they will.
Right. So Charlie Chester asked the following: how many schools do you see that have applied learning programs, say climate change clinics for students? Any data on whether they are getting students into the climate change arena post-graduation?
We don't have the data ourselves. I know anecdotally there's lots of programs and centers. We have part of our website, we have what's called the Solution Center. And on that Solution Center, we have a variety of resources, typically non-academic. It's more kind of the operational solutions. And in there, we'll have lists of case studies from different institutions that have made those. Be a good research project to see, student placement. We know students are demanding a lot out of the institutions that they apply to. I have a high school senior, and she's like looking at all these different pieces of the schools they're applying to, and sustainability usually ranks up pretty high for their school selection. So schools are responding to that and creating programs and institutes around it.
Okay, so let's see. Marianne Jorgensen asks, what importance do you think universities have to support the conservation of biodiversity and clean water? Importance of land beyond carbon sequestration. Do you all even get into that, or is carbon really what you're focused on?
We always talk about co-benefits, and I think it's a mistake to sometimes even lead with climate. So when we're working in the Midwest at an Indiana school, for example, we'll usually talk about energy independence and innovation and next generation jobs and those sorts of, that sort of framing. And so I really think and resilience, a lot happening in resilience in Indiana. A lot of times you want to just be careful, depending on your audience, what your message would be. We don't explicitly require tracking of those co-benefits as part of reporting to us. Therefore, we don't really know exactly. The tool, that SciMap tool, actually has a nitrogen calculator as part of it. So there is a bit of a nutrient tracking tool in there. But those co-benefits are really important. I didn't mention it, but we have a resilience commitment as well, which it's all about how are you increasing the adaptive capacity of your campus and your community. And usually in those conversations, you look at, as a campus and as a community, what do we prioritize? Do we prioritize, do we want our water to be clean or dirty? Do we want more biodiverse landscapes? Do we want more open space? And in those, like, here's our assets, here's our strengths, here's what we want to improve, those resilience conversations. Right. Oftentimes you'll bring up those sorts of features that Marianne's mentioning.
So Tim, you all appear to have successfully be in the process of surviving COVID. there are still a number of 450 schools that are on your map, and there's schools all over the country. Do you see this as growing through the pandemic and continuing to grow, or have you sort of hit a plateau?
So it kind of depends on what the this means. I think we definitely have a critical mass, and about 5 or 6 years ago, we made a strategic decision to not run a recruitment campaign just to add more people to sign up. Instead, we wanted people who made the commitment to actually follow through on what they committed to. And so that was intentional on our part. And so money of these resources was as a result of that strategic decision. And I think we're getting to a point where now adding a more campaign mentality and growth in number of schools that have committed makes a lot of sense for us organizationally. So much depends on external factors that aren't in our control, but depending on how elections go, depending on how different legislation that gets passed, the issue of climate, the urgency to act on climate, we know is not getting. In some ways, it's just so different than almost any other social topic. It's very different than like hunger, for example. Like hunger is terrible. Like we hate that hunger is with us. Hunger is with us. It's gonna, like, there will be hungry people, and there's tons of work that can be done there. If we don't solve this crisis if we don't see serious progress in the next 10 years, then it is a very radically different trajectory for us. And so we have this very narrow and targeted focus for increasing action. So to your question, it's not really about like what does it mean to grow? For us, it's really about, are we accelerating our sector in all the ways that we can possibly do that so that society is meeting its climate goals? And if we're not doing that, it doesn't really matter how much membership we have. It's not really, we're kind of trying to work ourselves out of a job in some sense. Like if we can meet this climate crisis and solve it, then that would be fantastic. That's what our mission is.
Well, Tim, I think we've come around to just about an hour, and I think you've answered most of the questions that are on the board. So let me thank you both for your insight and open the door to further collaborations. I think that there are lots of ways that we could work together on this issue and other issues to get universities to take an increasingly out front leadership role in moving society towards sustainability. So thank you so much for your help, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks so
Likewise,
much,
Jim. Thanks, Marianne. Thanks, Robin. Thanks for all the great questions, everybody. Feel free to be in touch.
All right. See you soon.